Good evening, College Park. This is your host, Soroush with breaking news of the hour. Today we'll be discussing and debating the impacts of neoliberalization processes on the roles and function of STPs, Sport for Development programs. We'll be focusing on the processes through which neoliberal ideologies, practices, and policies have been embedded in society and thus have become hegemonic. Moreover, our focus question of the evening will be whether or not the privatization of sectors such as healthcare, physical activity, and or education have either helped to alleviate or worsen the issues STPs are trying to solve. We'll be accompanied by a few reporters who will better help us answer these questions. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Patrick, and today we will be talking about the neoliberalization and how it affects STPs. I think it is important before we go in to how it affects STPs, it is important to understand what neoliberalization exactly is. So neoliberalism is an economic theory that became prevalent in the 1990s, shortly after the end of the Cold War. The main idea of it is deregulation and limits on government spending and influence in the economy, which is basically what modern day capitalism is today, through the funding and work of private organizations. As neoliberalism relates to SDPs in total, we can take a look at the impact that the United Nations has, along with the partners that they have collected, that would overall work and contribute to the development and success of SDPs and their overall goals. An important article to consider when looking at this would be Sport Serving Development and Peace, Achieving the Goals of the United Nations Through Sport, and this was written by Ingrid Bielter in 2008. Taking a look at this article provides a lot of information and statistics about how the United Nations and their partner organizations like the International Olympic Committee and UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund, help work towards SDPs becoming a reality. An important quote that I pulled from one of these articles was stating when the United Nations overall believed that sport would become, a very main factor in helping SDPs become, what they are today. And I quote, "It was in 2001 that the United Nations formally recognized sport could be used at the individual, community, and national, global levels as a mechanism to achieve specific targets in concerning poverty reduction and development of third world countries." So this shows how the UN was able to not only develop SDPs and work with partner committees like I mentioned previously, but also shows how neoliberalization has affected SDPs through the privatization of fundraising, as well as the privatization of work that they do overall. Now I'll be handing it over to you, Gianna, as you discuss more about the overall topic that neoliberalization has on SDPs.
Thank you for getting us started, Patrick. I think it's important to recognize the role sport can play in aiding international development. As you mentioned earlier, the International Development Goals STPs are trying to reach include economic growth, social progress, and environmental protection. Current emergent neoliberal hegemony is the exact opposite of the post-war social welfare consensus that took place from the 1960s to the 1980s. Within the neoliberal order, we've seen a retrenchment of state involvement in social life and a focus on individual and corporate freedoms, says Dr. Maurer, a professor from University of Maryland, in his lecture on development theory, practices, and institutions. We can see a shift of many public services such as education, hospitals, healthcare, housing, and physical activity being privatized. Lots of people are paying for these services through the private marketplace. The idea of neoliberalism is that through a reduction of state programs, trickle-down economics will occur and more money will be made available for individuals to shape their lives. This holds true for some people, but for those who are unable to afford specific programs, they lose control over their lives instead of gaining control. While many philanthropic organizations have good intentions, they aren't monitored as well as they should be. It's difficult to measure and evaluate the impact these organizations have and whether they're actually achieving the sustainable development goals set by the United Nations. With the privatization of aid groups, there's more room for areas to be overlooked. Turning it over to Sarah to hear what she has to say about the privatization of healthcare.
Thanks for that, Gianna. Now, in talking about neoliberalism democracy, we can focus in on the privatization of healthcare. There was a big shift from having healthcare in the public sector to having its priority given to these business interests. This was done in a way to promote these free markets, which in turn could really just help with the economic growth and the development as well. Now, healthcare, along with some of the other sectors, used to be a guaranteed right for the citizens of the United States. And now that it's privatized, the population has to pay for these services through these private marketplaces. Now, although there can be more choice provided for the healthcare options, this privatization ends up hurting some of our population. This is because they aren't able to get the same support since they aren't able to take advantage of, some of these better services that come with the choices that are available with the different healthcare options. So pretty much, these are things that are essentially necessary to improve people's quality of life. And everyone should be able to have this access to hospitals and healthcare, as mentioned by Dr. Maurer. So this kind of ends up worsening the issues that the SDPs are trying to solve because it can hurt some of the population that may not be able to get access to some of these better services. And also, in a way, it can help to alleviate issues because of the economic growth that comes with the privatization of healthcare, as well as some of the other services and sectors. So now let's get into the privatization of physical activity with Soroush. Thank you.
Thanks for your input, Sarah. Yeah, so a notion that I totally agree with is how privatized organizations such as UNICEF, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Save the Children, and others that are involved in different forms of global development are being strategically placed in areas where there could potentially be a high return on investment for the aid they provide. As mentioned in the lecture, most of the aid targeted to these nations is not a concern of extension from government and politicians, but rather from a private sector or series of investors who pick and choose what problems they want to be invested in. In fact, according to the main assumptions of neoliberal development, quote, politicians and bureaucrats are also rational actors. World politics is all about self-interest. Maurer. At the end of the day, this leads to many populations who are in dire need of support to be overlooked, as we see in today's world with many African and Middle Eastern countries. Moreover, in the reading by Svensson and Woods 2017, we learned how the sport of football was, quote, overwhelmingly found as the most popular structured sport to deliver programs of sport for development across the world, page 44. In the research, Svensson and Woods ultimately found that of the 3,000 organizational entries that were reviewed for SDP practices, only 955 of them had been identified to, quote, take part in SDP practice at the grassroots level, end quote. Coming out to an absurd 31% of total agencies, this comes to prove the assumptions of neoliberal development such that certain donors essentially pick and choose the problems in which they want to invest in and at which level, i.e. grassroots or hierarchical, they wish to pursue these developments depending on how big of an ROI or return on investment they can get. Oh, and by the way, the rest of the week is pretty rainy. All right, back to you, Olivia, for more.
Thank you so much for your insight, Soroush. So, like the sectors of healthcare and physical activity, the application of neoliberalism to education systems means that education systems would be operated according to free market principles. In education, this would mean that parents and students would be given more choice in education and more input to education systems. In addition, because schools would be private entities, they would have more direct oversight of what types of activities are being provided. As we've been talking about, it also means that there would be a motive to invest in areas where there is likely a return of that investment. Butler points out in Sports Serving Development and Peace that SDPs face some obstacles in order to be able to impact the quality of education. She recommends that the private sector will need to partner with governments and NGOs to ensure that they have the expertise necessary to allocate their resources to address issues like inequality and discrimination in access to sport, regional imbalances in sport programs, and providing sports that will serve the population that they are intended to serve. As far as education is concerned, the unequal distribution of capital in communities makes it difficult to imagine how sports for development and peace could overcome the polarization between the haves and the have-nots under a privatized education system. I think there has to be a clear understanding of the current consumption of sport in order to understand how SDPs would be able to positively impact privatized education overall. Now back to you, Soroush.
Alrighty, thank you guys for your input. This is all we have time for tonight. As always, thank you for choosing ASHD News Network. Until next time.